Chapter 5 of The History of the English Bible by John Brown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 5. Three Rival Versions. With the accession of Edward VI in January 1547, a change for the better came over the fortunes of the English Bible. The restrictions placed upon the printing and reading of the Scriptures were at once removed, and in the first year of the new reign an injunction was issued, requiring every beneficed person to provide within 3 months a copy of the English Bible of the largest volume, and within 12 months a copy of the Paraphrase of the Gospels by Erasmus, these to be set up in some convenient place in the church where they might be read by the parishioners. This English version of the Latin Paraphrase or Commentary of Erasmus was imprinted at London in Fleet Street at the sign of the Sun by Edward Whitchurch, the last day of January 1548. Several translators were employed in its preparation: Miles Coverdale, John Old, Nicholas Udall and others, and, curious to relate, the Princess Mary, afterwards Queen Mary, herself translated the greater part of the Paraphrase upon St. John's Gospel. As this work was required to be placed in the churches within a 12-month, several presses were engaged upon it, with the result that Dr. W. Aldous Wright found no fewer than 6 varieties of the Paraphrase in existence. Among the incidents of the time it is mentioned that in 1548 the churchwardens of St. Margaret's, Westminster, paid 5 shillings for the half part of the work, and in 1549 those of Wigtoft in Lincolnshire 7 shillings for the whole, and for a chain to fasten it 4d. From the same printing office in Fleet Street there had been issued the previous year the earliest edition of the Scriptures in Edward's reign, the only issue in 1547. It bore the title, The New Testament in English according to the Translation of the Great Bible. It was followed by many more. Short as Edward's reign was, no fewer than 40 editions either of the whole Bible or of the New Testament issued from the press. During this reign there also was produced a fragment of a version of the New Testament containing the Gospel of Matthew and the first chapter of Mark, which may be mentioned in passing as one of the curiosities of the time. It was the work of Sir John Cheke, Professor of Greek in the University of Cambridge, who had been also tutor to the King when Prince Edward. Milton, says he, taught Cambridge and King Edward Greek. The manuscript, which has unfortunately lost a leaf, is preserved in the library of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. It is in Cheke's beautiful handwriting, and though probably made in 1550, was not published till it was edited by the Rev. James Goodwin in 1843. Its special characteristic seems to have been an attempt to express the ideas of the original in home-born words and the language of the common people rather than in the semi-Latin then much in vogue. It may perhaps be described as an anticipation in the 16th century of what is known as the 20th century Bible of our own times. 1 or 2 extracts may show the kind of thing aimed at. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, a city of Jewry in King Herod's days, lo, then the wizards came from the east parts to Jerusalem, and asked where the King of the Jews was, that was new born. Come to me all that labour and be burdened, and I will ease you. Take my yoke on you, and learn of me, for I am mild and of a lowly heart, and ye shall find quietness for yourselves. And his disciples, seeing him walking on the sea, were troubled, saying that it was a phantasm, and they cried out for fear. Jesus by and by spoke to them, and said, Be of good cheer, it is I, fear not. Peter answered unto him, Sir, saith he, if it be thou, bid me come on the water unto thee. And he said, Come on. And Peter came down out of the boat and walked on the waters to come to Jesus. And seeing the wind strong, was afeard, and when he began to sink, he cried out. With the death of Edward VI and the accession of Queen Mary came change amounting to revolution. At once the public reading of the Scripture was prohibited, a proclamation of June 1555 denouncing the writings of Tyndale, Frith, Cranmer and Coverdale, and during these 5 years there was neither Bible nor Testament published in the realm. But Mary's policy of repression led indirectly to the production of that great Geneva version of the Scriptures which Dr Westcott described as the most important revision of the English Bible underwent before the final settlement of the received text. This was the work of some of those Protestant exiles who fled from the fires of persecution in their own land to the friendlier shelter of the Reformed churches abroad. They were scattered in various cities, in Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Basel, Zurich and Geneva. It is with those who settled in Geneva we are now concerned. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, was there. Miles Coverdale, Thomas Cole, once Dean of Salisbury, Christopher Goodman, formerly divinity professor at Oxford, John Pullion, a translator of Ecclesiastes, Esther and other books of Scripture into English verse, Anthony Gilby, Thomas Sampson and William Whittingham. Sampson had been Dean of Chichester in Edward's time and afterwards became Dean of Christ Church in Elizabeth's reign, and Whittingham was afterwards Dean of Durham. William Whittingham was the first among these exiles to take action in the matter of Bible translation. Born at Chester in 1524, at 16 he entered Brasenose College, graduating B.A. in 1540 and M.A. in 1547-48, having been elected Fellow of All Souls in 1545. In 1550 he went abroad for 3 years, spending his time chiefly at the University of Orleans, afterwards visiting the Universities of Germany and Geneva in 1552 and returning to England in 1553. Then came the time of exile when he went first to Frankfurt and afterwards to Geneva, where he succeeded Knox as minister of the English congregation there. In 1557 he published, anonymously, a revised translation of the English New Testament. It is thus described: "The New Testament of our Lord Jesus Christ, conferred diligently with the Greek and best approved translations, with the arguments as well before the chapters as for every book, at Geneva, printed by Conrad Badius, 1557." The text of this version is based upon Tyndale's, compared with the Great Bible, and influenced by Beza's Latin translation. It formed the groundwork of the New Testament printed in the complete Genevan Bible of 1560, but is distinct from it. It was the first Testament to be printed in Roman type, and also the first English version to adopt the division into verses made by Robert Estienne, the French printer, in his Greek Testament published in Geneva in 1551. With its elaborate apparatus it forms the first critical edition of the New Testament in English. The title page of this work contains a curious woodcut representing Time raising Truth out of her grave, with this motto appended: "God by time restoreth truth, and maketh her victorious." There is an address to the reader giving some account of the work, and stating that the text has been diligently revised by the most approved Greek examples and conference of translations in other tongues, and for the profit of the reader the text has been divided into verses and sections according to the best editions in other languages. It was not till 3 years later that this Genevan Testament of Whittingham's was followed by the complete Genevan Bible of 1560. The latter, unlike the former, was the joint production of several scholarly men acting together for the attainment of one common end. In their preface they speak of the eminently favourable conditions under which they were able to work, and when we recall the circumstances of the time we can feel the force of what they say. As translators they were fortunate in the place where their work was done, for Geneva, under the influence of Calvin, had become the centre to which were gathered some of the most eminent biblical scholars of the time, and apart from their fellow countrymen, exiles like themselves, there was at that time in Geneva a group of scholars who were engaged in the work of correcting the French versions of Olivetan, and they therefore found themselves in the company of men who, though working in another language, were engaged in a task similar to their own. Then again, they had the advantage of some new Latin versions not accessible to previous translators. Leo Juda had laboured for many years at a new Latin version of the Old Testament, which, though left unfinished at his death, was completed by others, and the Latin New Testament of Erasmus, having been revised by R. Gualtier, the whole Bible thus finished was printed in 1544. These Latin versions, and especially Beza's New Testament, furnished important help to the English scholars in what they regarded as their sacred task, and they of course inherited also the result of the labours of the English translators at home who had preceded them. In preparing the historical books they kept in the main to the old renderings, merely altering awkward or antiquated phrases here and there. In the other parts of the work the changes were more numerous. Taking a passage from the 19th chapter of Job, Dr. Westcott points out that there is considerable originality in the version they gave. Throughout the verses mentioned, "I am sure that my Redeemer liveth," etc., he finds the French rendering widely different. Of the 10 changes introduced into the text of the Great Bible, 3 of considerable importance are apparently original (7, 8 and 10), and of the remainder one perhaps comes from Leo Juda (2), 3 from Pagninus (1, 5 and 6), and 2 from Munster (4 and 9). The prophetical books are revised after the manner adopted in the historical books, but with more numerous changes, the influence of the French translation being most marked in the apocryphal books. In all parts they appear to have taken the Great Bible as their basis, correcting its text without substituting for it a new translation. Dr. Westcott concludes his examination of the Genevan Old Testament by saying, "There is abundant evidence to show that they were perfectly competent to deal independently with points of Hebrew scholarship, and minute changes in expression show that they were not indifferent to style." This Genevan Bible, completed 3 years after the publication of the Genevan Testament, went forth to the world under the title "The Bible and Holy Scriptures contained in the Old and New Testament, translated according to the Hebrew and Greek, and conferred with the best translations in divers languages, with most profitable annotations, at Geneva, printed by Rowland Hall, 1560, 420." Below these words there was a woodcut representing the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, and on the reverse of the title is a list of the books of the Bible including the Apocrypha. Then follows a dedication "to the most virtuous and noble Queen Elizabeth, from her humble subjects of the English Church at Geneva," and after this an address "to our beloved in the Lord, the brethren of England, Scotland, Ireland, etc., dated from Geneva, April 10, 1560." In this address, after pointing out that the former translations required greatly to be reformed, the translators went on to say, "Not that we vindicate anything to ourselves above the rest of our brethren, for God knoweth with what fear and trembling we have been for the space of 2 years and more, day and night occupied herein, but being earnestly desired, and by divers, whose learning and godliness we reverence, exhorted, we undertook this great and wonderful work, with all reverence, as the presence of God, as entreating the Word of God, whereunto we think ourselves insufficient, which now God, according to his divine providence and mercy, hath directed to a most prosperous end. God is our witness that we have by all means endeavoured to set forth the purity of the Word and right sense of the Holy Ghost for the edifying of the brethren in faith and charity." Contrary to what we should have expected, the Testament included in the complete Bible of 1560 differs from the Testament of 1557 in nearly 40 places. In 33 of these the rendering is new, and in 16 the alteration still maintains its ground. Recognizing these facts, Dr. W. F. Moulton concluded that the Testament is a careful revision of Tyndale, and that the Bible is again a careful revision of the Testament. On the whole, too, Beza's influence tended greatly to the improvement of the work, for by this mistakes were removed which had disfigured all preceding versions. Very many of the changes in the English Genevan New Testament have passed from that into our own Bible. Archbishop Trench, in his work on the Authorized Version, quoted 5 passages to show the very good and careful scholarship brought to bear upon the Genevan revision, in which it is the first to seize the exact meaning which all the preceding versions had missed. These are all derived from Beza. One other point should be noticed, to which Professor Plumptre calls attention. The Genevan revision, in both forms, omits the name of St. Paul from the title of the Epistle to the Hebrews, and, in a short preface, leaves the authorship an open question. The explanatory notes in this version were prepared by the Genevan translators, and with considerable care. In the Epistle to the Romans, for example, there are about 220 of these, and many also elsewhere, forming a kind of condensed commentary, supplying historical and geographical information, and clearing up obscure texts, but more often giving pithy observations on the narrative, as when we are told that Lot, thinking to get to Paradise, found a hell. We can well believe what we have been told that its phrases found echo in Scripture quotations from Shakespeare to Bunyan. The expense connected with the production of this version of 1560, which must have been considerable, was defrayed by the English community in Geneva, whose hearts, as the translators themselves tell us, God touched to encourage the revisers not to spare any charges for the furtherance of such a benefit and favour of God. Among the contributors was John Bodley, the father of the founder of the great Bodleian Library. Possibly for prominent service in this way rendered, he received from Queen Elizabeth a patent dated January 8, 1561, securing to him for 7 years the exclusive right to print in England the version which first came out in Geneva. The second edition of this version, the first in folio, published in 1562, appears to have been sent forth by him, though no printer's name is attached to the work. As already stated, the complete Genevan Bible, unlike the Genevan Testament of William Willingham, by which it was preceded, was the joint production of several workers. Long says that the chief of those employed upon it were Coverdale, Whittingham and Gilby, but he mentions also Goodman, Sampson, Cole, and certain others, as sharing in it. The completion of the work, however, seems to have fallen finally into the hands of Whittingham, Gilby and Sampson alone. Anthony a Wood gives the same 6 names as those mentioned by Lelong, but goes on to say that before the greater part was finished Queen Mary died, so that the Protestant religion appeared again in England. The exiled divines left Frankfurt and Geneva and returned into England. Howbeit Whittingham with 1 or 2 more, being resolved to go through with the work, did tarry at Geneva a year and a half after Queen Elizabeth came to the crown. The work thus produced by Englishmen in exile found truest welcome among Englishmen at home. For nearly 100 years the Genevan Bible was the favourite version of the common people. Several reasons would account for this. For one thing, being in a quarto shape, it was more easy to handle than the big folios which went before it. It was also easier to read, the type being in Roman and Italic, not Gothic, and easier for reference, retaining as it did the divisions into chapters and verses made by Estienne for the New Testament and by others for the Old Testament. It retained also the marginal notes of 1557, indicated by accentual marks the pronunciation of proper names, and in addition had woodcuts and convenient maps and tables. But most of all, next to the Bible itself, its notes and comments made it a welcome book to the devout men and women of Puritan days. Between its publication in 1560 and the appearance of the Authorised Version in 1611, it went through 60 editions, and even after the Authorised Version had appeared 10 more editions were added to the 60 which went before. Right on to the days of the Civil War it continued to be the Bible of the Puritan household. In 1576 a revised edition of the book was brought out by Lawrence Thomson, private secretary to Sir Francis Walsingham, which while having the Old Testament unchanged, made alterations in the New. He entitled it The New Testament translated from the Greek by Theodore Beza. It was dedicated to F. Walsingham and F. Hastings, and became so popular that it was frequently substituted for the Genevan Testament of the Genevan Bible. The text is not much altered, but the commentary in the margin received enlargement. One of the peculiarities of this version is that Thomson closely followed Beza, putting that or this for the ill by which Beza had rendered the emphatic force of the Greek article, as for example in John 1:1, "In the beginning was that word." The grotesque effect of this is seen in Thomson's rendering of 1 John 5:12. "He that hath that Son hath that life, and he that hath not that Son of God hath not that life." With his commentary he seems to have been himself well pleased, for he says of it, "I dare avouch it, and whoso readeth it shall find it, that there is not one hard sentence nor dark speech nor doubtful word, but is so opened and hath such light given to it that children may go through with it, and the simplest that are may walk without any guide, without wandering and going astray." In 1576, the same year this revision by Thomson appeared, there appeared also the first English Bible printed in Scotland. It is the Genevan version, the title expressed in the same words, with the difference that it is stated to be "printed in Edinburgh, be Alexander Aberneth, printer to the King's Majesty, dwelling at Ye Kirk of Field, 1579." The title of the New Testament portion is in this form: "At Edinburgh, printed by Thomas Bassandyne, 1576 folio. It is an exact reprint of the first folio edition of 1561 to 1562. Bassandyne's name does not appear on the title of the Old Testament, which was the last to be printed, being completed by his colleague Alexander Aberneth in 1579, Bassandyne dying in the interval. By order of the General Assembly, every parish in Scotland subscribed to a fixed amount before the work was undertaken, the price being £4 15 shillings 4 pence. Scots currency. So firm was the hold this book gained in the country that as late as the close of the 18th century a Genevan Bible was still in use in the church of Crail at Fifeshire. Though in the earlier years of Elizabeth's reign 4 editions of Tyndale's Testament are assigned to the years 1561, 1566, 1570, it does not appear that the Bibles of Coverdale, Taverner or Matthew were ever reprinted after 1553. The only 2 versions, therefore, which were publicly prominent were the Great Bible and the Genevan version. And as between these 2 the superiority of the text and translation of the latter and its increasing popularity made it very unlikely that it would ever be superseded by the former. Yet the Genevan Bible could never with the bishops' consent become the only Bible of the nation, not because it was Calvinistic in doctrine in its notes and commentary, for the bishops themselves were Calvinistic in those days, but because in its general trend it was hostile to the Episcopal Church system. Not only did it again and again translate the word ecclesia not by church but by congregation, but in its exposition of the meaning of locus in Revelation chapter 9 verse 3, for example, we come upon such a passage as this: Locusts are false teachers, heretics, and worldly subtle prelates, with monks, friars, cardinals, patriarchs, archbishops, bishops, doctors, bachelors, and masters, which forsake Christ to maintain false doctrine. Clearly this kind of teaching must not be permitted to go forth, tacked on to the Bible and unchallenged. Archbishop Parker, therefore, who had been consecrated in 1559, took the matter in hand somewhere around 1563-4. Strype tells us that he took upon him the labour to contrive and set the whole work a-going in a proper method, by sorting out the whole Bible into parcels, and distributing those parcels to able bishops and learned men to pursue and collate each the book or books allotted them, sending withal his instructions for the method they should observe. In a letter preserved under date 1566 among the State Papers, though probably belonging to an earlier year, Parker writes to Sir William Cecil, telling him how he has distributed the Bible in parts to divers men's, and even going so far in courtliness to that great statesman as to express the hope that he will undertake the revision of some one epistle of St. Paul or Peter or James. Another letter from Parker to Cecil gives the facts concerning the separate distribution of the work. He himself, in addition to prefaces and other introductory matter, undertook to translate Genesis and Exodus in the Old Testament and Matthew and Mark, and then from 2 Corinthians to Hebrews inclusive in the New Testament. Richard Davies, the Bishop of St. David's, a man who had laboured zealously for the spiritual good of his native country of Wales, took the translation from Joshua to 2 Kings, that is, 2 Samuel, while Sandys, Bishop of Worcester, continued the work on to the end of Chronicles. William Alley, who had succeeded Coverdale as Bishop of Exeter, translated Deuteronomy. Miles Coverdale, though still living after his resignation of his see, took no part in the work, he being now an old man over 80. Parkhurst, Bishop of Norwich, along with Barlow, Bishop of Chichester, made himself responsible for the apocryphal books. Andrew Perne, Master of Peterhouse and Dean of Ely, translated Ecclesiastes and Canticles. The Bishop of Winchester was the translator from Isaiah to Lamentations, and the Bishop of Lichfield and Coventry of the rest of the greater prophets, while Grindal, Bishop of London, took the minor prophets. Coming again to the New Testament, the Bishop of Peterborough translated the Gospels according to Luke and John, the Bishop of Ely the Acts and the Romans, the Dean of Westminster the first epistle to the Corinthians, and the Bishop of Lincoln the general epistle to the book of Revelation. Altogether there were 8 of the bishops concerned in the undertaking, a fact which gave the name to the book of the Bishop's Bible. It was published in folio in 1568, the colophon intimating that it was imprinted at London in Povey's churchyard by Richard Jugg. A splendid copy was presented to the Queen, the accompanying letter bearing the date October 5th, 1568. The Bible itself has no dedication, but in the centre of the title is a portrait of the Queen, and at the beginning of Joshua and the Psalter, portraits of the Earl of Leicester and Cecil are introduced. It was furnished also with a table of the books of the Old Testament, with tables of lessons and psalms, an almanac and calendar, 2 prologues, a chronological table and table of contents. Woodcuts, maps, and other tables were also introduced. When the book was ready for publication, the Archbishop, through Cecil, endeavoured to obtain the Queen's recognition on its behalf, with what result does not appear. Eventually Convocation in the Constitutions and Canons Ecclesiastical of April 1571 ordered that every Archbishop and Bishop should have at his house a copy of the Holy Bible of the largest volume, as lately printed at London, and that it should be placed in the hall or large dining room, that it might be useful to their servants or strangers. Each cathedral also should have a copy, and, as far as it could conveniently be done, all the churches. Later on, in the articles issued by Archbishop Whitgift in 1583, the 10th ordered that one kind of translation of the Bible be only used in public service, as well as in churches and chapels, and that to be the same which is now authorized by the consent of the bishops. The adoption of the Bible thus authorized, if not by the Crown, by Canons Ecclesiastical and by the Archbishop, does not seem to have been readily or universally made. One reason may have been its costliness. The price at which the first edition was sold in 1571 was 27s. 8d, or about £16 in present value. Still a second edition, in a small quarto volume, was issued in 1569, a third of the Bible, and an edition of the New Testament only followed in 1570-1571. In all about 40 editions of this version appear to have been published, one half of these containing the whole Bible. It seems certain that while the Genevan held its own the Great Bible was entirely displaced by the bishops, no edition of it appearing to be printed after 1569. It is, however, not to be forgotten that the Book of Psalms in the new revision had to yield in the end to that of the Great Bible. The edition of 1572 prints both in parallel columns, one properly belonging to the version, the other taken from the Great Bible. That there were defects in this version we might expect from the way in which it was brought about. The work was, as we have seen, given out in parcels to different men, each man acting independently, and there was no common meeting for the purpose of discussing the various renderings. The final revision was left in the hands of Parker himself, who, as Archbishop, was a very busy man, and not conspicuously eminent as a scholar, and one at least of the others did not give very much time to his task. It is said that the revision of the books of Kings and Chronicles was dispatched in about 7 weeks by Bishop Sandys. As to the comparative value of the version as a whole, we are fortunate in possessing the deliberate judgment of 2 eminent members of the Revision Company, who brought out the revised version of 1881, Bishop Westcott and Dr. W. F. Moulton. They are agreed in the opinion that the Greek scholarship of the revisers of the Bishop's Bible is superior to their Hebrew scholarship. Dr. Westcott says that in the historical books of the Old Testament they followed the text of the Great Bible very closely. They were lacking in independence. The influence of the Genevan revision is perceptible throughout, but it is more obvious in the prophets than elsewhere. He concludes by saying, there is but little to recommend the original rendering of the Bishop's Bible in the Old Testament. As a general rule, they appear to be arbitrary and at variance with the exact sense of the Hebrew text. In like manner, Dr. Moulton, after examining the passage in 2 Samuel chapter 23 verses 1 to 7, wherein 7 verses of the Great Bible and the Bishop's differ about 18 times, finds that 15 of the new renderings in the latter were taken from the Genevan version. Of the 18 changes, 13 may be called improvements. With one exception, they are derived from the Genevan Bible, from which also come 2 changes which are clearly for the worse. About 12 better renderings found in the Genevan Bible are at the same time here neglected. After examining 1 or 2 other passages, Dr. Moulton gives judgment by saying, the conclusion from this investigation is not very favourable to the Bishop's Bible. In the Old Testament, Cranmer's Bible was too closely followed, and improvements which were ready to the hand of the translators were not appreciated. What is original in this version does not often possess any great merit. So far as the New Testament is concerned, the second edition was carefully revised. Dr. Westcott takes the passage in Ephesians chapter 4 verses 7 to 16 as an illustration of how much merit is due to this part of the work. Having shown that in this passage the Great Bible and the Bishop's Bible differ in 26 places, he adds, of these 26 variations, no less than 16 are new, while only 10 are due to the Genevan version, and the character of the original corrections marks a very close and thoughtful revision, based faithfully upon the Greek. He further shows that throughout the entire epistle the changes amount to nearly 50, and among the new readings are some phrases which have become very familiar to us, as less than the least of all saints, middle wall of the partition, fellow citizens with the saints. It may be mentioned that copies of the chief editions of the Bishop's Bible are preserved in the British Museum, in the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge, in the Rylands Library, and in that of the British and Foreign Bible Society. And now at this point a notable fact occurred. As the Genevan version of 1560 was followed in the way of a correction by the Bishop's Bible of 1568, so this again was followed with the same purpose by the Roman Catholic version of the New Testament in English, known as the Rheims Douai Bible of 1582. It was printed abroad and appeared in England bearing the following elaborate title: The New Testament of Jesus Christ, translated faithfully into English, out of the authentical Latin, according to the best corrected copies of the same, diligently conferred with the Greek and other editions in divers languages, with arguments of books and chapters, annotations and other necessary helps, for the better understanding of the text, and specially for the discovery of the corruptions of divers late translations, and for clearing the controversies in religion in these days, in the English College of Rheims. Psalm 118. Give me understanding, and I will search thy law. Those things specially must be commended to memory which make most against heretics, whose deceits cease not to circumvent and beguile all the weaker sort and the more negligent persons. Printed at Rheims by John Fogney, 1582, cum privilegio. This version was the work of Roman Catholics who had fled from persecution in Elizabeth's time and were connected with the seminary at Douai and the English College at Rheims. The translation was made from the Latin Vulgate by 3 men, Gregory Martin, William, afterwards Cardinal, Allen, and Richard Bristow. The first named was the one most actively concerned in the work. He had been a scholar of St John's, Oxford. In 1570, the year of Elizabeth's excommunication, he went over to Douai, and then became divinity reader at Rheims. Wood speaks of him as an excellent linguist, exactly read and versed in the sacred scriptures, and went beyond all of his time in humane literature. He was also the writer of an appendix to the Testament entitled A Discovery of the Manifold Corruptions of the Holy Scriptures by the Heretics of our Days, in which he endeavoured to overturn all Protestant versions and so clear the ground for the new version now being set forth. He was answered by Dr Fulke, Master of Pembroke Hall, Cambridge, who published a Defence of the Sincere and True Translation of the Holy Scriptures into the English tongue, against the manifold cavils of Gregory Martin. In the preface in which the translators of Rheims version state their object, they frankly say that it is not their idea that Scripture should always be printed in the mother tongue and be freely read by all. That was not the belief of their Church, as was testified by the Constitutions of Arundel and by the decree of the Council of Trent, which said that the Scriptures may not be indifferently read of all men, nor of any other than of such as have express license thereunto of their lawful ordinaries. Their forefathers did not suffer every Sciolist to translate, or every husbandman, artificer, prentice, maid, and man to read the Bible, making it the subject of table talk for ale benches, boats, and barges. They repudiate the idea that it is from envy that the priests keep the holy book from the people. The reason is that the Church would have the unworthy repelled, the curious repressed, the simple measured, the learned humbled, and all sorts so to use them, or abstain from them, as is most convenient for everyone's salvation. Their sole purpose now in sending forth the Bible in the vernacular is for the more speedy abolishing of a number of false and impious translations put forth by sundry sects, and for the better preservation or reclaim of many good souls endangered thereby. In choosing the text of Scripture from which to translate, they also frankly admit that they have not selected the original Greek, but the Latin Vulgate translation of the Greek. They have done so because the latter was in use in the Church 1300 years ago. It is that which St. Jerome corrected, according to the Greek, by appointment of Damasus the Pope. It was commended by Augustine, has been used in the Church's services, has been declared of the Council of Trent of all Latin translations to be the only authentical, and it is the gravest, sincerest, of greatest majesty, least partiality, as being without all respect of controversies and contentions, especially those of our time. After giving other reasons, they conclude with one which should have rendered all others unnecessary, when they say that the Vulgate is not only better than all other Latin translations, but than the Greek text itself in those places where they disagree. For the first heretics were Greeks, and the Greek Scriptures suffered much at their hands. The Hebrew text was said to have been foully corrupted by the Jews, and the Greek by heretics. This apology in effect admits that the Rheims version has no independent authority as a text. Still, it is to be remembered on the other side that Jerome's Latin translation was derived from Greek manuscripts more ancient than any we now possess, and is sometimes, therefore, of great value as giving us in disputed passages the text current in the earliest times, and its testimony is in some cases confirmed by manuscripts discovered in more recent times. This merit is, however, minimized by the fact that the common copies of the Vulgate, of which the Douai Bible is one, have not always preserved the pure Latin text of Jerome, but have been deteriorated in the course of constant copying from one generation to another. The need of new examination was recognized even as early as the Council of Trent. The Rhemish translators deserve credit for their treatment of the Greek article. As the Latin language has no definitive article, it might be supposed that this would be a weak point with them, but it is not so. Dr. Moulton discovered, in a comparatively hasty search, more than 40 instances in which, of all versions from Tyndale to the Authorized Version included, the Rhemish alone is correct in regard to the article. Its translators had evidently made use of the Greek text as well as that of the Vulgate. They have also preserved significant phrases of the original and impressive arrangements of words, such as "the liberty of the glory of the children of God," "holiness of truth," "by their fruits ye shall know them," "ye are not come to a palpable mountain." Then, too, the translation "our lamps are going out" is unquestionably correct, and there are phrases in the first chapter of the Epistle of James, such as "upbraideth not," "nothing wavering," "the engrafted word," and "bridleth not," which are effective as well as correct. It may be added to this that Dr. Westcott has given a list of Latin words from a single epistle which King James's translators have taken from the Rhemish Testament: separated, Romans 1 verse 1; impenitent, 2 verse 5; approvest, 2 verse 18; propitiation, 3 verse 25; remission, id; glory in tribulations, 5 verse 3; commendeth, 5 verse 8; concupiscence, 7 verse 7; expectation, 8 verse 9; confession is made unto salvation, 10 verse 10; emulation, 11 verse 14; conformed, 12 verse 2. As we might expect, the trend of the translation in some places is unduly in the direction of Romish doctrine, as for example when we read, "In those days cometh John the Baptist preaching in the desert of Jewry, saying, Do penance." Similarly, "If ye have not penance, ye shall all likewise perish," and "not willing that any perish, but that all return to penance." "Remember your prelates which have spoken the word of God to you." "By good works make your calling and election sure." But apart from this tendency, there were renderings which to Englishmen must have been as an unknown tongue, and could scarcely be called translations. For example, instead of "he humbled himself," we read "he exinanited himself." "The passions of this time are not condign to the glory to come." "Our wrestling is against princes and potestas." against the rectors of the world of this darkness, against the spirituals of wickedness in the celestials. Give us today our supersubstantial bread. An English reader must have been in sheer despair when, as a translation of Psalm 57 verse 10, he read the following: Before your thorns did understand the old briar, as living so in wrath he swallowed them. With a similar feeling he must also have greeted such words as these: audible, coinquination, corruption, exprobrate, longanimity, obsecration, and xenophagia. No wonder Thomas Fuller called this book a translation needing to be translated. The Old Testament portion of this version was not published till 1609 and 1610, though it seems to have been ready at the same time as the New Testament in 1582. The delay arose from lack of means, or as they express it, from the one general cause our poor estate in banishment. It appeared under the title The Holy Bible Faithfully Translated into English out of the Authentical Latin, diligently conferred with the Hebrew, Greek, and other editions in divers languages, by the English College of Doway, printed at Doway by Lawrence Kellam, at the sign of the Holy Lamb, 1609 to 1610, 2 volumes 4 quartos. The complete work was reprinted in Rouen in 1635. In 1749 to 50, and again in 1763 to 4, editions of the Douai New Testament and the Rheims New Testament were published, each edition in 5 volumes. This revised form is substantially the version used at the present day by English-speaking Roman Catholics. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The History of the English Bible by John Brown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 6. The Authorized Version of 1611. When James I came to the English throne in 1603, after the appearance of the Bishop's Bible in 1568, there had been no further revision of the Scriptures for more than a generation. The Great Bible of 1539, partly because it was heavy and costly, and partly also because it had been superseded by the Bishop's Bible, had long ceased to be reprinted. Old copies, no doubt, were still to be found here and there in village churches, but there were no new issues. And yet that Bible by which it had been superseded had not really taken firm and enduring hold of the popular mind. Dean Plumptre said, and said truly, that of all the English versions the Bishop's Bible had probably the least success. It did not command the respect of scholars, and its size and cost were far from meeting the wants of the people. Its circulation appears to have been practically limited to the churches which were ordered to be supplied with it. There were only 6 editions in quarto and 1 in octavo, the other 13 were in folio. On the other hand, the Genevan version retained its unrivalled popularity. Between 1568 and 1611 there were no fewer than 16 editions in octavo, 52 in quarto, and 18 in folio. Thus there seemed to be little prospect of unity in the matter of Bible usage. For the Genevan version was too pronouncedly Puritan in its notes and comments to be acceptable to the authorities of the Church, while the version favoured by the bishops had too many drawbacks ever to win its way among the people at large. So matters remained till the beginning of the reign of King James I, when, as one may say, in an almost accidental way, a new version was projected and prepared, that of the Authorized Version of 1611, which ultimately had the happy effect of uniting the whole nation for more than 2 centuries and a half in the use of the same book as the household Bible of the English people. James I was proclaimed king on the 24th of March 1603, and on the 7th of the following May he entered London to take possession of the throne. Between these 2 dates, and while he was the guest of the Cromwells of Hinchinbrook near Huntingdon, he was approached by certain of the Puritan clergy who presented him with what is known as the Millenary Petition. This was a petition for the abolition of certain usages in the Church which they regarded as superstitious and savouring of Rome, also against longsomeness of service, profanation of the Lord's Day, and against excommunication by such lay persons as the Archdeacon's commissary and without the consent of pastors. They had some good conference with His Majesty and gave him a Book of Reasons. Though no definite answer was given to their plea at that time, it was not altogether fruitless, for the following October the king appointed a meeting to be held in January 1604, for the hearing and determining of things pretending to be amiss in the Church. This meeting has taken its place in history as the Hampton Court Conference, and it is said that on the second day of this conference Dr. Reynolds, the leader of the Puritans, moved His Majesty that there might be a new translation of the Bible, because those which were allowed in the reign of King Henry VIII and Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. Though this statement is made in Dr. Barlow's Sum and Substance of the Conference at Hampton's Court, there is reason to doubt whether it gives a quite accurate account of what actually took place. The Puritans were somewhat roughly handled at the conference, and were there only to plead for concessions to their views which they knew the bishops were unwilling to grant. And that they should, under such circumstances, have been the originators of the idea of a new authorized version seems somewhat improbable. Moreover, it is at variance with what the translators of the version have themselves told us in that preface of theirs prefixed to the version. What is there said is as follows: "The very historical truth is, the conference having been appointed for hearing the complaints of the Puritans, and when by force of reason they were put from all other grounds, they had recourse at last to this shift, that they could not with good conscience subscribe to the Communion Book, the Book of Common Prayer, since it maintained the Bible as it was there translated, which was, as they said, a most corrupted translation. And although this was judged to be but a very poor and empty shift, yet even hereupon did His Majesty begin to bethink himself of the good that might ensue by a new translation, and presently after gave order for this translation which is now presented. This is a much more probable account. It is the account given by the translators themselves, and from it we are entitled to say that the idea of the authorized version of King James was really started by King James himself. It is clear that the king was more in earnest about the matter then than anyone else. Some of the bishops, at any rate, looked coldly upon it. Bancroft, Bishop of London, said at the same time that if every man's humour was to be followed, there would be no end of translating. The king thought otherwise, thought that pains ought to be taken to secure one uniform translation, to be made by the best learned in both the universities, reviewed by the bishops, then presented to the Privy Council, and finally ratified by his royal authority. And so this whole Church is to be bound unto it and none other. Thus, in this unexpected and almost accidental way, came about the first conception of that authorized version, whose tercentenary we are now celebrating in 1911. In the practical carrying out of that conception, again, the king was most actively concerned. Convocation met shortly after the conference, but not a word appears to have been said there on the proposed revision. The king, however, did not let the matter fall into forgetfulness. He must have been already making inquiries at the universities as to what learned men there were fit for the enterprise, for on the 22nd of July 1604 he wrote to the Bishop of London, telling him that he had chosen 54 translators to meet in various companies at Westminster, Oxford and Cambridge, under the presidency of the Hebrew professors of the two universities and the Dean of Westminster. He further asked him to move the bishops to inform themselves of all such learned men within their several dioceses as had especial skill in the Hebrew or Greek tongues, and to write to them urging them to send any observations they had made on previous translations to Mr. Lively, the Hebrew reader in Cambridge, or to Dr. Harding, the Hebrew reader in Oxford, or to Dr. Andrews, Dean of Westminster, to be by them imparted to their several companies. It is somewhat surprising to find that the scheme so promptly outlined hung fire for the next 3 years, nothing further being done, so far as we know, till 1607. From that point, however, the work proceeded with vigour. The 54 learned men mentioned by the king, but afterwards, possibly by death, reduced to 47, were divided into 6 companies, 4 for the Old Testament and Apocrypha, and 2 for the New Testament. The company meeting at Westminster under the presidency of the Dean, the saintly Lancelot Andrews, and consisting of 10 persons, were to undertake the revision of Genesis on to 2 Kings inclusive. The company meeting at Cambridge, and consisting of 8 persons, were to take from 1 Chronicles to Ecclesiastes inclusive. The company meeting at Oxford, consisting of 7 persons, were to make themselves responsible for the prophets from Isaiah to Malachi. A separate company, also meeting at Cambridge, were to undertake the Apocrypha. Then, as to the New Testament, a second company meeting at Oxford were charged with the revision of the four Gospels, the Acts and the Apocalypse, a second Westminster company taking from Romans to Jude inclusive. Rules for the guidance of these different companies were elaborately drawn up beforehand. They were to take the Bishop's Bible as their basis, altering it as little as the truth of the original would permit. The names of the prophets and writers, and also other names in the text, were to be given as commonly used, and the old ecclesiastical words to be kept, as, for example, the word church was not to be translated congregation. The translations by Tyndale, Matthews, Coverdale, and those of the Great Bible and the Genevan version were to be used when agreeing better with the text than the Bishop's Bible. Each separate translator was first to go over the part assigned to him by himself alone, then all were to meet together, confer as to what they had done, and agree as to what should stand. Selden in his Table Talk tells us further as to their method of procedure. They took, says he, an excellent way. That part of the Bible was given to him who was most excellent in such tongue, and then they met together, and one read the translation, the rest holding in their hands some Bible, either of the learned tongues, or French, Spanish, Italian, etc. If they found any fault, they spoke; if not, he read on. When the several companies had completed the portions assigned to them, there would still be a necessity for general supervision. So far as we know, the 6 companies never met as one body, but when 3 years had been spent in revision, the writer of the life of John Boyes tells us arrangements were made for a general supervision, the whole work being finished, and 3 copies of the whole sent from Cambridge, Oxford and Westminster to London. A new choice was to be made of 6 in all, 2 out of every company, to review the whole work and extract 1 copy of all these to be committed to the press, for the dispatch of which business Mr Downes and Mr Boyes were sent up to London, where, meeting their fellow labourers, they went daily to Stationers' Hall, and in 3/4 of a year fulfilled their task, all which time they had from the company of stationers 30 shillings each per week duly paid them. Last of all, Bilson, Bishop of Winchester, and Dr Miles Smith again reviewed the whole work, and prefixed arguments to the several books. The 3 years of slow and patient scholarship spent on the Authorised Version were not completed without a certain touch of pathos. It has been often told how the Venerable Bede completed the translation of John's Gospel in the closing hours of life. "It is completed now," said the boy scribe. "Thou hast said the truth," replied the dying man. "All is ended. Take my head in thy hands. I would sit in the holy place in which I was wont to pray." And seated there, while he chanted the Gloria, his soul passed away. A kindred story has come down to us concerning Dr Reynolds, one of the translators of the version of 1611, of whom Thomas Fuller says you could never tell which was greater, his learning or his goodness. He was one of the company engaged upon the books of the prophets, but in the course of the work he was seized with consumption and slowly faded out of life. Yet, as Featley tells us, for his great skill in the original languages, the other members of the company had recourse to him once a week, and in his lodgings perfected their notes. In a great part of the sickness of which he died, the meeting was held in his rooms at Corpus Christi in Oxford, and he, lying on his pallet, assisted them, and in a manner, in the very translation of the books of life, was translated to a better life. The striking document which all the revisers adopted as their preface to the new version was drawn up by Dr Miles Smith, afterwards Bishop of Gloucester. As serious minded men they felt, they said, the importance of the work they had taken in hand. There was need of translation, for translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain that we may look into the most holy places. By doing the work they had done they had no thought of disparaging those who had been in the field before them. Rather they acknowledged them as having been raised up of God for the building and furnishing of his church, and deserved to be had of posterity in everlasting remembrance. If they, building upon their foundation, and being helped by their labours, are only trying to make that better which they left so good, no man would have cause to mislike them. Indeed, their predecessors, if they were alive, would thank them. When they took up the work, at first, it was no thought of theirs that they had to make a new translation, nor yet to make a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones one principal good one, not justly to be excepted against. They felt they had to tread a difficult path, for it is hard to please all even when we please God best. For he that meddleth with men's religion in any part meddleth with their custom, nay, with their freehold. Yet, though difficult, how important the work! For what is piety without truth? What truth, what saving truth, without the word of God? What word of God, whereof we may be sure without the Scriptures? If we are ignorant, they will instruct us. If out of the way, they will bring us home. If in heaviness, they will comfort us. If dull quickens us, or cold inflame us. The Bible is not only an armour but also a whole armoury of weapons, both offensive and defensive. It is not merely a tree, but a whole paradise of trees of life. It is a treasury of most costly jewels, a fountain of most pure water springing up to everlasting life. With wise thoughts like these, thus briefly summarized, the translators commend their readers to God and to the Spirit of His grace, which is able to build further than we can ask or think. In 1611 the book upon which they had laboured so faithfully appeared from the press of Robert Barker, printer to the King's most excellent Majesty. The title occupies the centre of an engraving, on the right and left of which are the figures of Moses and Aaron, with the 4 evangelists at the corners. At the top in Hebrew characters is the second name of God, with the Holy Dove beneath. The New Testament has a separate title, within a woodcut border, representing along one side the badges of the 12 tribes of Israel, and along the other the 12 Apostles, the emblems of the 4 evangelists being at the corners. The book was issued in folio size, and being well printed in fine black Gothic letter, presented a handsome appearance. There seems to be no authority for calling it the Authorized Version, since, so far as is known, there was no edict of convocation or Act of Parliament, or decision of Privy Council, or royal proclamation giving it authority. The words "appointed to be read in the churches" mean not authorized, but, as explained on a page in the preliminary matter, how the Scriptures were arranged for public reading. In many editions these words were omitted. Possibly it was described as authorized, as taking the place, and consequently assuming the privileges, of the Bishop's Bible, by which it was preceded. There seems to have been 2 impressions of the first edition of 1611, probably due to the impossibility of one printing office being able to supply in the time allotted the 20,000 copies required. The pair are distinct throughout every leaf, and are the parents of millions of our Bibles. They are distinguished by calling the first the Great He Bible and the other the Great She Bible, from their respective readings of Ruth chapter 3 verse 15. One reading, "He measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her," and "He went into the city." The other has "and she went into the city." These 2 editions, both standard but varying in many places, seem to have been deposited in 2 different printing houses as standard copy, for the subsequent editions in quarto and octavo run in pairs, he and she, and as a rule the faults of each follow those of its own office copy. The She Bible has a yet more distinctive mark in translating Matthew chapter 26 verse 36, "Then cometh Judas," instead of Jesus, "unto the place called Gethsemane." The He Bible is by some regarded as the true first edition, and as giving the true reading, and on this point is sustained by the Revised Version of 1881. On the other hand, the She Bible is in accord with almost every other edition. In 1612 the original folio was followed by a quarto edition in Roman type, and also by one in octavo, resembling in appearance the octavo copies of the Genevan version. In that year also appeared the first quarto New Testament. It was not, however, the first separate New Testament of King James's version, for a 12mo edition had been published in 1611. The 2 ancient universities, which in so enterprising a manner produced the most recent Revised Version of 1881, rendered important service also in reprints of the Authorized Version by which it was preceded. In 1629 there appeared the first complete edition of King James's version ever printed at Cambridge. A separate New Testament in 32mo was, however, printed there the previous year. The 1629 edition had undergone very careful revision. Great care also had been exercised in the matter of punctuation, and as to the words to be printed in italics. In 1638 appeared the first folio edition of the Authorized Version printed at Cambridge. This again gave evidence of careful and extensive revision of the text, italics and marginal readings, and it remained the standard text until the publication of the Cambridge edition of 1762. In this edition, however, in spite of all the care, appeared the reading in Acts chapter 6 verse 3, "Whom ye may appointeth," instead of "whom we," etc. As this reading gave power of appointment of officers to the people rather than to the apostles, the alteration has often been ascribed to the Puritans and was reputed to have cost Cromwell a bribe of £1000. Yet here it was in 1638, and before long Parliament days. The Standard Edition, as it has been called, of 1762, prepared by Dr Thomas Paris of Trinity College, Cambridge, was issued from the University Press in 4 volumes folio. In this again a further serious attempt was made to correct the text, by amending the spelling and punctuation, regulating the use of italics and removing printers' errors. Marginal notes also were received into the place that they have since occupied, and were much extended. The greater part of this impression of 1762 was destroyed by fire at Dodd's the booksellers. To pass by intervening editions, a high place for care and laborious exactness must be assigned to the Cambridge Paragraph Bible, in 3 parts 1870-73, edited by Dr Scrivener. This has ever since been regarded, as for correctness, the standard text of the Authorised Version. Within the last few years, 1903-1905, also, Dr Scrivener has published an edition of 5 volumes folio of King James's Version, with the text revised by a collation of its early and other principal editions. This work deserves special mention for several reasons, and certainly not least for this, that it is a superb piece of typography. It was edited for the Syndics of the University Press, Cambridge, and was printed at the press founded by Mr Cobden Sanderson at Hammersmith. The type was designed by Mr Emery Walker, in imitation of the beautiful fount of type used by Jenson, the famous Venetian printer, in 1472. The book has been well described as one of the most beautiful Bibles ever printed. Mention may also be made of the fact that, by way of celebrating the tercentenary of the Authorised Version, Dr Aldous Wright, Vice Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, has issued an edition in 5 volumes, giving an absolute faithful reproduction of the original text, the text reprinted being that of the first of the 2 issues of 1611. It was not till 1675 that the sister University of Oxford entered upon the work of Bible publication. In that year appeared in quarto the Holy Bible printed at the Theatre, Oxford. A second edition from the same press came out in 1679, and among the booksellers' names on the title page is that of Thomas Guy, at the corner of Little Lombard Street, who had grown rich by the trade in Bibles, had increased his wealth by successful speculation in South Sea stock, and before his death in 1724 founded the great hospital known by his name. 3 years later the Oxford Press sent forth its first folio reprint of the Authorised Version, this being followed by an imperial folio copy printed at the same press by John Baskett. The latter was a magnificent edition, printed in large type and illustrated by many plates engraved on steel. It came, however, to be nicknamed the Vinegar Bible because the headline of Luke chapter 22 reads, "Of the parable of the vinegar," instead of the vineyard. Of this most sumptuous of all the Oxford Bibles, 3 copies at least were printed on vellum. Unfortunately, its fine appearance was discounted by so many misprints that it acquired another nickname, and came to be called, from its printer, a "basket full of printers' errors." In 1769 there came out another folio copy known as the Oxford Standard Edition, edited and revised by Dr Benjamin Blayney of Hertford College, who followed the lines of Dr Paris's Cambridge edition of 1762. This and the quarto edition, commonly called Dr Blayney's editions, were adopted as standards by the University Press, Oxford, in 1769, and are still the Oxford Standard. In 1833, when Samuel Collingwood and Company were the University printers, there was sent forth in quarto an edition with the title The Holy Bible, an exact reprint, page for page, of the Authorised Version published in the year 1611. And now in this tercentenary year there has again been issued a reproduction in Roman type, page for page, of King James's Bible as published in 1611, with a biographical introduction by Mr A. W. Pollard. Turning back to the past for a moment, we find that in 1633 there was printed in Scotland by Robert Young, a Londoner, the first edition of King James's version, which then began to supplant the Genevan version in the north. In 1714 the earliest edition of the same version was printed in Ireland, and in 1782 a 12º edition of the earliest English Bible, avowedly printed in America, came from the press of R. Aitken in Philadelphia. This was followed in 1793 by one printed in Worcester, Massachusetts, by Isaiah Thomas, whom Benjamin Franklin called the Baskerville of America. Beyond such details as these just given, it is not possible to follow all the fortunes of the great version of 1611. The catalogue of the Library of the British and Foreign Bible Society enumerates nearly 1,000 separate editions of the English Bible, or some part of it, published before the close of the 18th century, and this one society has since its foundation in 1804 sent out in English alone no fewer than 72 millions of copies. The appearance of this version, therefore, is one of the great facts in the history of the world. What it has been in personal life and character, in the family, in the history of churches and nations, can only be known when the great day of final revelation shall come. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The History of the English Bible by John Brown. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 7. The Revised Version of 1881. The Authorized Version of 1611, whose history we have followed, won its way gradually to national acceptance, and did so not because invested with royal authority, but by virtue of its own intrinsic excellence. Its one and only competitor of influential sort was the Genevan version, which is still in great favour with many. Indeed, the same year in which the new revision appeared, two other editions of the Genevan, a folio and a quarto, were published by the King's printer, and for 5 years more further editions continued to be sent forth. Then, too, even after 1616, when it ceased to be printed in England, it continued to be printed abroad and sent over to this country. But at length this competition came to an end. The revision of 1611 obtained wider acceptance, and soon became without question the Bible of the English people. Still, as the book became better known, the question of further revision began to be discussed. There is no finality in human affairs, and each generation has to take its own part and place in the general advance. Deepening acquaintance led to deeper certainty that, in spite of all the care which had been taken, numerous errors, verbal and otherwise, had been retained in the version so recently revised. And others came to be added from time to time as new editions, edited with insufficient care, were sent forth into the world. For example, the edition of 1631 acquired the name of the Wicked Bible because it read, "Thou shalt commit adultery," instead of "Thou shalt not." In the editions of 1638 it was stated that the fire devoured 20,050 men instead of 250. He slew 2 lions like men instead of 2 lion-like men. Taught by the people of men, for by the precept of men. These are only a few examples out of many, and the list was made longer by the importation of Bibles from abroad. The printers of Amsterdam made the discovery that Bible printing might be developed into a lucrative business, and sent over considerable consignments to this country. It scarcely needs to be pointed out that English Bibles set up by Dutch compositors were not likely to be productions of unfailing accuracy. The process went on so long and so far that in 1643 the Assembly of Divines at Westminster found it necessary to make a report to Parliament on the subject, giving instances of mistakes which had been made, such as "found the rulers" for "found the mules," corruption for conception, condemnation for redemption. It was resolved in consequence that foreign Bibles should not be sold until they had been passed and allowed. It was stated in 1646 at Amsterdam that an English printer there had sent out in 5 years 40,000 copies, that his last edition consisted of 12,000 copies, and that altogether in that Dutch city 150,000 English Bibles had been printed. In Bibles produced in this country, as well as in those sent from abroad, new errors were made and old ones copied from one to another. A considerable sheaf of mistakes, such as the following, came to be gathered by observant readers. Shall glean for shall not glean. In the throne of David for in the room of David. Shined through darkness for walked through darkness. Delighted herself for defiled herself. And I praise you for I praise you not. This kind of process went on year after year, repeating itself and extending itself. When Dr. Scrivener set about making the Cambridge Paragraph Bible of 1873 as strictly accurate as possible, the changes, most of them trivial, but many not trivial, which had to be made to the text, were to be counted by hundreds. Then, too, as another reason for revision, language itself undergoes change, and words pass out of use or become unintelligible. So again, there are many words which, while still in use, are understood in a different sense from that prevailing in 1611. The translators in writing attached one meaning, we in reading quite another, so that words which once served as stepping stones to the reader become stumbling blocks in his path. Instances of this may be found in such cases as where carriage means baggage, Acts chapter 21 verse 15, careful, anxious, Philippians chapter 4 verse 6, liberal, noble, and curl, crafty, Isaiah chapter 32 verse 5, delicately, luxuriously, Luke chapter 7 verse 25, and publican, a revenue officer. Then again, as to the manuscripts of the Greek text from which translations had to be made, it stands to reason that in the manuscripts from which we translate, the nearer we get to the time when the Gospels and Epistles were written, the more likely we are to get to the actual words first written. Now it is well known that what are regarded as the most authoritative manuscripts of the Greek text of the New Testament have, with two exceptions, come to light since the time of the translators of 1611. Of the Usquil manuscripts, the most ancient and important are the Sinaitic, written in the 4th century and now deposited in the Imperial Library at St. Petersburg, the Vatican, also of the 4th century and preserved in the Vatican Library at Rome, the Alexandrine of the 5th century, now in the British Museum, the Ephraim Codex of the 5th century in the National Library at Paris, Beza's Codex of the 6th century in the University Library, Cambridge, and the Claromontani, also of the 6th century, which formerly belonged to Beza but is now in the National Library at Paris. Yet not one of these was available at the time when King James's translation was made. The Vatican manuscript, one of the two oldest, though known to be in existence as early as 1587, was so jealously guarded at the Vatican, so far as the New Testament was concerned, that not till the first half of the last century could its text be ascertained, and then only by a comparison of 3 more or less imperfect collations. Whereas now we have a magnificent reproduction in photographic facsimile of the entire manuscript. The Sinaitic manuscript, also of the 4th century, was discovered by Dr. Tischendorf as recently as February 4th, 1859. The Alexandrine was not brought to light until 1628, when it was presented to Charles I by Cyril Lucar, Patriarch of Constantinople. And although the Ephraim Codex was brought to Europe in the early part of the 16th century, it was not known to contain a portion of the New Testament until towards the close of the 17th century, and was not collated until 1716. Then, too, manuscripts are not our only source of knowledge of the original text of the Scriptures. There are ancient versions, such as the Old Latin, the Old Syriac, and the 2 Egyptian versions, all of which came to be accessible to the scholars of the 19th century as they were not to the revisers of 1611, and from their early date must have been made from the earliest manuscripts, and were likely therefore to furnish, in the case of disputed passages, valuable suggestions as to the actual words employed at first. Thus the possession of greatly improved apparatus furnished an additional reason for undertaking a further revision. By the time that the Authorized Version was 40 years old, men's thoughts began to be turned to the subject. As early as 1655 the Long Parliament made an order that a bill should be brought in for a new translation of the Bible, and 4 years later the House directed that it be referred to a committee to send for and advise with Dr Walton, Dr Cudworth and others, such as they should think fit, to consider of the translations and impressions of the Bible, and to offer their opinions therein. The committee met from time to time at the house of Bulstrode, Whitelocke, but eventually the death of Cromwell put an end to all further endeavours in the way of revision. Nothing was done, as we might expect, after the coming of the Restoration, but in the 18th century various tentative efforts were made, some of them by able men. Revised translations of the New Testament were made by Gilbert Wakefield in 1795, by Archbishop Newcome in 1796, and by Scarlett in 1798. But then came the French Revolution and frightened Englishmen. In 1796 the note of alarm was sounded in a letter to the Bishop of Ely, and as Dr Plumptre has said, from that time conservatism pure and simple was in the ascendant. To suggest that the authorized version might be inaccurate was almost as bad as holding French principles. When we pass into the 19th century, the long defeated hope was revived by the appearance of lectures in 1810 by the Lady Margaret, Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, Dr Marsh, afterwards Bishop of Peterborough. In his first edition he plainly said, "It is probable that our authorized version is as faithful a representation of the original scriptures as could have been formed at that period. But when we consider the immense accession that has since been made, both to our critical and philological apparatus, when we consider that the most important sources of intelligence for interpretation of the original scriptures were likewise opened after that period, we cannot possibly pretend that our authorized version does not require amendment." The italics here given are the Professor's own. 46 years later the Rev. William Selwyn, another Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, spoke out to the same effect. In a work of his entitled Notes on the Proposed Amendment of the Authorized Version of the Holy Scriptures, he said, "I do not hesitate to avow my firm persuasion that there are at least 1000 passages of the English Bible that might be amended without any change in the general texture and justly reverenced language of the version." Professor Selwyn also brought the subject of revision before the Lower House of Convocation of the Province of Canterbury, and that same year, 1856, Mr Heywood, MP for North Lancashire, moved in the House of Commons an address to the Crown, praying that Her Majesty would appoint a Royal Commission of learned men to consider of such amendments of the authorized version of the Bible as had been already proposed, and to receive suggestions from all persons who might be willing to offer them, and to report the amendments which they might be prepared to recommend. About the same time also there was published a translation of the Gospel of John, newly compared with the original Greek and revised by 5 clergymen. The 5 clergymen were Dr John Barrow, George Moberly, D.C.L., Henry Alford, B.D., W. G. Humphrey, B.D., and Charles J. Ellicott, M.A., their purpose being to show by example the kind of thing in the way of revision many were desiring to see. That same year also Dr Trench, then Dean of Westminster, published his work, On the Authorized Version of the New Testament, pleading for movement in the same direction. The first actual step was taken on February 10, 1870, when a resolution was moved in the Upper House of Convocation by Bishop Wilberforce and seconded by Bishop Ellicott, that a committee of both houses be appointed to report upon the desirableness of a revision of the authorized version of the New Testament. On the motion of Bishop Ollivant, seconded by Bishop Thirlwall, it was agreed to enlarge this resolution so as to include the Old Testament also, and the resolution so amended was ultimately adopted and communicated to the Lower House the following day, where it was accepted without a division. The committee thus appointed, consisting of 7 bishops and 14 members of the Lower House, met on March 24 and agreed to report that it was desirable that a revision be undertaken, that it should comprise both marginal readings and such emendations in the text of the authorized version as may be found necessary, that it should not contemplate any new translation of the Bible or any alteration of the language except where, in the judgment of the most competent scholars, such change is necessary, and that where such change was made the language of the existing version should be closely followed. Finally, that it was desirable that Convocation should nominate a body of its own members to undertake the work of revision, who shall be at liberty to invite cooperation of any eminent for scholarship to whatever nation or religious body they may belong. This report was presented to the Upper House on May 3rd, where its adoption was carried unanimously, and a committee appointed to carry it into effect. In the Lower House an attempt was made to confine the revision to scholars in communion with the Church of England. This, however, was unsuccessful, and the adoption of the report was carried with 2 dissentients only. The Joint Committee held their first meeting on May 25th and agreed to separate into 2 companies, one for the revision of the Old Testament and one for that of the New. They also selected the scholars who should be invited to join the companies and decided upon the general rules which should guide their procedure. The rules agreed upon were: to introduce as few alterations as possible consistent with faithfulness, to keep as far as possible to the language of the authorized and earlier versions, each company to go twice over the portion to be revised, the text to be adopted to be that for which the evidence is decidedly preponderating, to make or retain no change in the text on the second and final revision by each company except 2/3 of those present approve the same, to revise the headings of chapters, pages, paragraphs, italics and punctuation, and finally to refer on the part of each company, when considered desirable, to divines, scholars and literary men, whether at home or abroad, for their opinions. The Old Testament Company, as at first constituted, consisted of 24 members. An equal number acted also for the New Testament. In the course of the 10 years they were at work, changes from various causes had to be made, and ultimately the revisers consisted of 65 English scholars who took part in the work. Of these 41 were members of the Church of England and 24 members of other churches. Of the latter number 2 represented the Episcopal Church of Ireland, 1 the Episcopal Church of Scotland, 4 the Baptists, 3 the Congregationalist, 5 the Free Church of Scotland, 5 the Established Church of Scotland, and 1 the United Presbyterians, 1 the Unitarians, and 2 the Wesleyan Methodists. Varied representation was still further secured by the cooperation of a number of American scholars, selected and invited by the Rev. Dr. Schaff of New York, acting on behalf of the English companies. Various causes of delay, however, intervened, and it was not until July 17, 1872, that the communication was made that the American companies were duly constituted. It thus came about that the English revisers of the Old Testament had already made some progress, had in fact gone twice through the Pentateuch before they secured the cooperation of the American Old Testament Revision Company. The English New Testament Company assembled for the first time on Wednesday, June 22, 1870. They met in the chapel of Henry VII, and there united in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. After this act of worship they formally entered upon the task assigned them. Through the kind arrangement of Dr. Stanley, then Dean of Westminster, the Jerusalem chamber of the Abbey was assigned as their place of meeting. This room, as Dr. Nuth, one of the revisers, reminded us, is one of more than ordinary interest. Originally the parlour of the Abbot's palace, it was here the assembly of divines of Commonwealth days, driven by the cold from Henry VII's chapel, held its 66th session on October 2, 1643, and there thenceforward continued to meet until its closing session of February 22, 1649. Here were prepared the Westminster Confession of Faith and the longer and shorter catechisms which formerly played so conspicuous a part in the religious education of the Presbyterians of Scotland and the Independents of England. And here also, just 50 years later, assembled the commission appointed by William III to devise a basis for a scheme of comprehension in a revision of the Prayer Book. It was in this same room the New Testament Company held their meetings for 10 years, except on the few occasions when it was not available. Dr. Nuth has further told us of the method of procedure. The company assembled at 11 a.m. and continued in session till 6 p.m. with an interval of a half hour. Prayer being offered and preliminary matters of correspondence disposed of, the chairman read a short passage as given in the authorized version. The question was then asked, first as to textual changes. That being settled, the chairman asked for proposals of rendering, and free discussion having followed, the vote of the company was taken. They resolved the work should be thoroughly done, but eventually grew alarmed at the probable length of the time the revision would take. At the end of the 9th day of meeting, not more than 153 verses had been revised, an average of only 17 verses a day. By and by, however, progress became more rapid, but even then the average did not rise above 35 verses a day. The first revision of the Gospel of Matthew was completed on the 36th day of meeting, May 24, 1871, and that of John on the 103rd day, February 19, 1873. The first revision of the Apocalypse, the final book, was completed on the 273rd meeting, August 20, 1877. The meetings were held monthly for a session of 4 consecutive days, excepting only August and September. Thus the first revision required 241 meetings during 60 monthly sessions. The second revision was completed on December 13, 1878, having occupied on the whole 96 meetings, or about 2 years and a half. Then came the suggestions of the American Company for consideration, and these, together with the preparation of the preface, occupied the Company until November 11, 1880, on which day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, after 10 years and 5 months of labour, the revision of the New Testament was brought to its close. On the evening of that same day, being St. Martin's Day, the Company assembled in the church of St. Martin's in the Fields, and there united in a special service of prayer and thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for the happy completion of their labours, for the spirit of harmony and brotherly affection that had pervaded their meetings, and for the divine goodness which had permitted so many to give themselves continuously to this work, and prayer that he whose glory they had humbly striven to promote might graciously accept this their service, and deign to use it as an instrument for the good of man and the honour of his holy name. The New Testament was published on May 17, 1881, and that same day was also presented to the Queen. The revision of the Old Testament, being of a much larger book, took longer time than that of the New, but in one important respect the work was much simpler than that which the New Testament Company had before them. They had no difficulty in determining the original text from which to translate, whereas in the case of the New Testament that was often a matter for anxious and prolonged consideration. The received, or as it is commonly called, the Masoretic text of the Old Testament Scriptures has come down to us in manuscripts which are of no great antiquity. The earliest of which the age is known is as late as AD 916, and they all belong to the same family or recension. That there were other recensions at one time is probable from the fact that there are variations in the ancient versions, the oldest of which, the Greek Septuagint, was, in part at least, made over 2 centuries before the Christian era. But as the state of our knowledge on this subject is not at present such as to justify any attempt at an entire reconstruction of the text on the authority of these versions, the revisers felt it most prudent, as they tell us, simply to adopt the Masoretic text as the basis of their work, and, following the example of the translators of the Authorized Version, to depart from it only in exceptional cases. The revision of the Old Testament was commenced on the 30th of June 1870 and was completed in 85 sessions, occupying 792 days and ending on 20th June 1884. The greater part of the sessions were for 10 days each, and each day the Company generally sat for 6 hours. The labour therefore was great, but ungrudgingly rendered, and the revisers, like their brethren of the New Testament Company, brought their long task to a close with a feeling of deep thankfulness to Almighty God, and the earnest hope that their endeavours might with His blessing tend to a clearer knowledge of the Old Testament Scriptures. The revision of the Authorized Version of the Apocrypha was included in the arrangement between the companies, and the representatives of the presses of Oxford and Cambridge, the publishers and proprietors of the new version. But this last portion of the work was not to be undertaken until the other and greater portions of the work were concluded. As early, however, as March 21, 1879, it was resolved that after such conclusion the Company should be divided into 3 committees, to be called the London, Westminster and Cambridge Committees, whose work should be the revision of the Apocrypha also. This was done, and thus in 1895 was completed the work begun in hope and prayer no less than 25 years before. This work in its completed form as a revision of the great version of 1611 has been spreading more and more widely among the Christian people of the land. It has not escaped criticism. No work of man's hand can hope to do that. In many ways it is open to criticism, but it has made a new Bible for many, and made plainer to them the revelation of the mind of God. What does this renders effectual service to humanity? The Bible is the greatest of all books. There are many echoes in the world, said Goethe, but few voices. This book is a living voice carrying its own authority with it. As the Confession of Faith of the Scottish Church declared, Amongst the arguments whereby the Holy Scriptures doth abundantly evidence itself to be the Word of God, are the heavenliness of the matter, the efficacy of the doctrine, the majesty of the style, the consent of all the parts, the scope of the whole. End of chapter 7. And end of The History of the English Bible by John Brown. Recorded for LibriVox by Marianne Spiegel in July 2016.